I'd lived next door to Mrs. Evelyn Marlowe for nearly a decade, and in all that time I'd always admired her from a distance. She was the kind of woman who held herself with such quiet dignity that it was impossible not to respect her. At 63, Evelyn was a widow, having lost her husband 5 years ago. Since then, she'd lived alone, except for the occasional visit from her adult children. I'd help her with small tasks around the house whenever I could, but it had always been strictly neighborly until that evening. I'd just returned from work, still wearing my button-down shirt and slacks, when I saw her outside struggling to carry a box into our living room. "Let me help you with that," I called over, walking toward her porch. She smiled, grateful but tired, as she brushed a strand of silver hair behind her ear. "Thank you, Nathan. My hands aren't as steady as they used to be." I picked up the box with ease, following her into the living room. It was a cozy space filled with warm tones and the scent of lavender, a place that instantly made me feel at ease. As I set the box down on her coffee table, she sighed, looking at me with those deep blue eyes that had always seemed so full of wisdom and warmth. "I don't know what I'd do without your help," she said softly, her voice carrying a hint of something deeper, something that made my heart skip a beat. "It's no trouble at all," I replied, but I could feel the shift in the air between us. She looked at me for a long moment, her eyes searching mine as if trying to say something without words. I'd never seen her like this before, so vulnerable, so open, and that's when it happened. She reached out and touched my arm, her fingers soft and warm, lingering longer than they should have. I froze, the weight of her touch sending a shiver down my spine. It was such a simple gesture, but it carried with it an unspoken question, one that neither of us had the courage to answer just yet. "Evelyn, is everything okay?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She nodded slowly, but there was something in her eyes that told me otherwise, something she wasn't ready to admit yet. She withdrew her hand, letting out a soft sigh as she stepped back. "Would you stay for a while?" she asked hesitantly. "I could use the company." My heart raced. I knew I should say no, that I should leave before things got too complicated. But there was something in her voice, something in the way she looked at me that made it impossible to refuse. "Of course," I said, sitting down on the couch. We talked for a while. The conversation lied at first about the neighborhood, her garden, the weather, but as the evening wore on, the mood shifted. Our words became slower, more thoughtful, and the silences between us grew longer. Each time our eyes met, I could feel the tension building, a tension that neither of us wanted to acknowledge. And then, as the clock struck 9, she stood up, her hands trembling slightly as she walked over to the window. She stared out into the darkness, her back to me, and for a long moment she said nothing. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "I've been so lonely, Nathan," she whispered. "Since John passed, I didn't realize how much I missed having someone around." I stood up, unsure of what to do, unsure of what she wanted from me. But something in me couldn't leave her standing there alone, not when she had just opened up to me in a way she never had before. I walked over to her, standing close enough to feel the warmth of her body but not touching her. "You're not alone, Evelyn," I said softly. She turned to face me, her eyes filled with unshed tears, and before I could stop myself, I reached out and gently wiped one away. Her skin was soft beneath my fingertips, and in that moment the distance between us seemed to evaporate. "Nathan," she breathed, her voice full of uncertainty and desire. "I don't know if this is right." I didn't either. But the way she looked at me, the way she leaned into my touch, made it clear that she needed something from me, something I wasn't sure I was ready to give. Yet as I stood there, my hand still resting on her cheek, I knew that whatever this was between us, it was real. It was wrong, yes, but it was also undeniable. I leaned in, my lips brushing hers softly, testing the waters. She didn't pull away. Instead, she kissed me back, her lips tentative at first, then growing more insistent as the kiss deepened. "Evelyn," I whispered against her lips, my voice hoarse with emotion. She pulled back just enough to look at me, her eyes searching mine. "Are we really going to do this?" I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that I couldn't stop myself from wanting her, from needing her in a way I'd never expected. She looked into my eyes, her breath trembling as she waited for my response. I didn't have the right words, not when my mind was a whirlwind of emotions, desire, guilt, fear. But I knew in that moment I didn't want to walk away. Something had shifted between us, something neither of us could ignore any longer. I leaned in again, this time with more certainty, my lips finding hers in a kiss that was both tender and urgent. Her hands came up to rest against my chest, fingers curling into the fabric of my shirt as if she was holding on to me for dear life. I could feel the rapid beat of her heart, matching my own. Evelyn deepened the kiss, her lips parting slightly as a soft sigh escaped her. The sound sent a shiver down my spine, awakening something inside me I hadn't felt in a long time. I wrapped my arms around her waist, pulling her closer, feeling the warmth of her body against mine. For a moment the world outside ceased to exist. There was no right or wrong, no consequence, only the intoxicating sensation of her mouth on mine, her body melting into me. We stumbled backward, our lips never breaking contact as we made our way toward the couch. I could barely think, barely breathe as my hands found the curve of her hips, guiding her gently down to the cushions. She looked up at me, her eyes dark with desire, and in that moment I knew there was no turning back. "Nathan," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I don't know if I can stop." I didn't know if I could either. My entire body was on fire, every nerve ignited by the way she looked at me, the way her fingers traced small circles on my arms. I leaned down, kissing her softly, my lips brushing against her ear as I whispered, "Then don't." Her breath hitched, and I could feel the tension between us building, the air thick with unspoken longing. She reached up, pulling me closer, her lips capturing mine in a kiss that was filled with both hesitation and need. I could taste the salt of her tears, feel the tremble of her hands as they slid up my back, but I didn't stop, I couldn't. I kissed her again and again, each one more fervent than the last, until finally she pulled back just enough to look into my eyes. Her face was flushed, her lips swollen from our kisses, and her chest rose and fell rapidly as she struggled to catch her breath. "I haven't felt this way in so long," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. I brushed a strand of hair from her face, my thumb gently caressing her cheek. "Neither have I." We sat there for a moment, both of us trying to process what was happening, what we were about to do. But the more I looked at her, the more I realized that this wasn't something we could deny. It was like a current pulling us both in, impossible to resist. And deep down, I didn't want to. Evelyn's hand slid down my chest, resting just above my heart, and I could feel the warmth of her touch through the thin fabric of my shirt. It was a simple gesture, but it sent a jolt of electricity through me, and I found myself leaning into her touch, craving more. "Are you sure?" she asked softly, her voice laced with uncertainty. "Are you really sure about this?" I didn't hesitate. I wasn't sure about anything else in my life, but I was sure about her, about this moment. I nodded, my hand sliding down to rest on her thigh, the heat of her skin searing through the thin material of her dress. "Yes," I whispered, my voice raw with desire. "I'm sure." That was all the confirmation she needed. She pulled me down to her, her lips crashing against mine with a passion that left me breathless. Her hands were everywhere, exploring my body with a desperation that matched my own. I could feel the need in her touch, the years of loneliness and longing finally finding release in this moment. As I kissed her, my hands began to roam, tracing the curve of her waist, the smooth skin of her neck, the softness of her shoulders. Every touch, every caress was like fuel to the fire burning between us, and I could feel the last of my restraint slipping away. We moved together in perfect sync, our bodies molding to each other as if they had always belonged that way. Her breath hitched as my hand slid up her leg, and I could feel the shiver that ran through her body at the contact. I kissed her again, my lips trailing down her neck, her pulse racing beneath my touch. "Nathan," she breathed, her fingers threading through my hair as she pulled me closer. "Don't stop." I didn't. I couldn't. I kissed her again, my hands exploring every inch of her, committing every curve, every soft sigh to memory. The tension between us had reached its breaking point, and I knew there was no turning back now. We spent what felt like hours tangled together, lost in the heat of the moment. Every touch, every kiss, was filled with a passion that left us both breathless, and by the time we finally pulled away, we were both trembling with exhaustion. Evelyn lay back on the couch, her chest rising and falling rapidly as she tried to catch her breath. I sat beside her, my hand still resting on her leg, and for a long moment neither of us said a word. The room was filled with the sound of our heavy breathing, the weight of what had just happened hanging in the air between us. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "What have we done?" I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that something had shifted between us, something we couldn't take back. The line had been crossed, and there was no undoing it. "Evelyn," I said softly, reaching out to take her hand, we can't pretend this didn't happen." She nodded, her eyes filled with a mix of guilt and desire. "I know." We sat there in silence, both of us grappling with the reality of what we had done. The passion that had consumed us only moments before now gave way to a sense of confusion, of uncertainty. What were we supposed to do now? Where did we go from here? "I don't regret it," I said finally, breaking the silence. She looked at me, her eyes searching mine for a long moment before she whispered, "Neither do I." And with those words, I knew that no matter what came next, we had crossed a line we could never uncross. We were no longer just neighbors, no longer just two people living next door to each other. We were something more now, something complicated, something forbidden. As we sat there, the weight of our actions settling over us, I knew that this was just the beginning of something neither of us could fully understand. And though I didn't know what the future held, I knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again. Evelyn's breathing slowly calmed as we sat there together in the stillness of her living room. The heat of our passion still lingered in the air, but the weight of what had just happened began to settle heavily on both of us. I could feel the emotions swirling inside me, desire still pulsing through my veins, but also guilt and uncertainty creeping in, casting long shadows over what had felt so intense and undeniable only moments ago. She turned to me, her eyes soft and uncertain, and for a moment we just stared at each other, the enormity of the situation dawning onto us both. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she whispered, her voice fragile, as if she were admitting it more to herself than to me. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak yet. My mind was racing with thoughts of what this meant, how it had started so simply and escalated into something neither of us had prepared for. I wanted to tell her everything, how I had been drawn to her in ways I couldn't explain for years, how her vulnerability had only deepened my feelings, but I couldn't find the right words. "I don't regret it," I said again, more firmly this time, wanting her to understand that I meant it, that I wasn't going to shy away from what had happened between us. Her eyes welled with tears, but she smiled, a small, bittersweet expression that tugged at my heart. "I don't either, Nathan. I felt so disconnected from myself for years, but tonight you made me feel alive again." I reached out, taking her hand gently in mine. Her fingers were cold now, trembling slightly as they wrapped around mine. We sat in the quiet, only the distant hum of the refrigerator filling the silence between us. There was so much unsaid, so much that neither of us had the courage to express just yet. The reality of what we'd done, the repercussions, the tangled emotions, all of it loomed large in the space between us. But what could we do now? We had crossed that invisible line, and there was no going back to the way things were. We could pretend, we could try to cover up the cracks in our respective lives, but the truth was that this, whatever this was, had changed us both. Evelyn squeezed my hand and spoke softly, almost in a whisper. "What now?" Her question hung in the air, and I didn't have an answer. I could feel the same question echoing in my mind. What now? What did we do now that we had crossed a boundary neither of us had expected to reach? "I don't know," I admitted, my voice hoarse from the tension still tight in my chest. "But I do know that this, whatever this is between us, it's not something we can just ignore." Evelyn looked away, her gaze settling on the fading light outside the window. "I know, but it's so complicated, Nathan. This can't. I don't even know how to begin dealing with this." I understood. It wasn't just about what we wanted. There were so many other things to consider: her family, my place in her life, the neighbors who might see something in our interactions, and the way everything had changed in the space of a few hours. But I couldn't deny how I felt, and I didn't think she could either. You don't have to figure it all out tonight, I said, moving closer to her, feeling the pull between us that hadn't diminished at all. Let's just take it one step at a time. Evelyn looked at me, her face softened by the vulnerability in her expression. One step at a time, she echoed, as if the idea itself brought some small sense of relief. I nodded, brushing my thumb lightly over her hand. We'll figure it out. Together. A tear slipped down her cheek, and I leaned in, pressing my lips gently to her forehead. She closed her eyes at the touch, a soft sigh escaping her lips as she relaxed into me. For a brief moment it felt like everything else melted away, the complications, the doubts, the reality of what we had just done. All that remained was the two of us, connected in a way that transcended everything else. But the moment didn't last. Slowly, Evelyn pulled away, her expression shifting as the weight of reality began to settle in again. I need some time to think, she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. This is so much. I didn't expect any of this. I understand, I said, standing up from the couch and taking a step back, giving her the space she needed. I'll leave you alone for now, but I'm here, Evelyn. I'll always be here. She looked up at me, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, and for a moment I thought she might ask me to stay. But instead she nodded, a sad smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Thank you, Nathan, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I hesitated for a moment, torn between wanting to comfort her and knowing that she needed time to process everything that had happened. Finally, I turned and made my way to the door, my heart heavy with the knowledge that whatever came next, we would never be the same. As I stepped outside into the cool night air, I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing thoughts. The sky was dark now, the stars scattered across the heavens like tiny pinpricks of light. I glanced back at Evelyn's house, the warm glow from her living room window casting a soft light into the night. My mind was still buzzing with the intensity of what had just happened, the memory of her touch, her kiss, still fresh on my skin. But I knew that this was only the beginning. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with questions and doubts that neither of us had answers to. And yet, despite the uncertainty, I couldn't shake the feeling that this, whatever it was something I couldn't walk away from. Not now. As I made my way back to my own house, I couldn't stop thinking about her, the way her eyes had looked into mine, the way her body had fit so perfectly against me, the unspoken connection that had blossomed between us in the span of a single evening. It was wrong, and yet it felt so right. And so I found myself lying awake that night, my mind racing with thoughts of Evelyn, of what we had done and what we might become. The quiet of the house seemed to amplify the emotions swirling inside me, and I knew that sleep wouldn't come easily. I rolled over, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts drifting back to the moment when our lips had first met, when everything had changed. The weight of that kiss, the intensity of her touch, it was all still there, lingering in the air between us like a secret we could never share. But despite the uncertainty, despite the guilt and confusion, I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't ready to let go of Evelyn. Not yet. The days that followed were a blur of emotion. Every time I saw Evelyn, it was as if the air between us crackled with tension, an invisible thread pulling us closer, even as we tried to keep our distance. We still exchanged polite greetings in the mornings, still made small talk about the garden or the weather, but underneath the surface, something had shifted. I couldn't stop thinking about that night, the softness of her touch, the intensity of our kiss, the way she had made me feel alive in a way I hadn't experienced in years. And I could tell from the way her eyes lingered on mine, from the way she seemed both nervous and excited in my presence, that she felt it too. But neither of us spoke of it. We couldn't. It was too complicated, too risky. And yet, the more we tried to pretend nothing had happened, the more the pull between us grew. One evening, a few weeks after that fateful night in the living room, I found myself pacing restlessly in my kitchen, unable to focus on anything. My thoughts kept drifting back to Evelyn, to the way she had looked at me that night, and to the unspoken desire that still simmered between us. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to see her, had to know if she felt the same way, if she was struggling with the same emotions I was. Before I could second-guess myself, I grabbed my jacket and headed next door, my heart pounding in my chest. When she opened the door, I could see the surprise in her eyes. For a moment, we just stood there, staring at each other, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between us. "Evelyn, I need to talk to you," I said, my voice trembling slightly. She hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside, gesturing for me to come in. The living room was dimly lit, the same room where everything had changed between us. The memories of that night flooded back, making my heart race even faster. We sat down on the couch, the tension thick in the air. For a long time, neither of us spoke, both of us unsure how to begin. "I can't stop thinking about that night," I finally admitted, breaking the silence. "About us." Evelyn looked down at her hands, her fingers fidgeting nervously in her lap. "Neither can I," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I reached out, gently taking her hand in mine. "I don't know what this is, Evelyn, but I know I can't pretend it didn't happen. I can't just walk away from what I feel for you." Her eyes met mine, and for the first time since that night, I saw the same mixture of fear, desire, and confusion reflected in her gaze. "Nathan, this is so complicated. I never expected this. Us. But you're right. I can't ignore it either." We sat there holding hands, both of us grappling with the weight of our emotions. The silence stretched on, and I could feel the tension between us growing, the unspoken pull that had been building for weeks reaching its breaking point. Without thinking, I leaned in, my lips brushing hers in a soft, tentative kiss. She didn't pull away. Instead, she kissed me back, her hand reaching up to cup my face as the kiss deepened, all the pent-up desire and emotion we had been holding back finally finding release. In that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the complications, not the risks, only the way her lips felt against mine, the way her body pressed against me, the way our hearts seemed to beat in unison. The kiss grew more urgent, more passionate, and before I knew it, we were tangled together on the couch, our hands exploring each other with a hunger that couldn't be denied. Evelyn, I whispered against her skin, my voice hoarse with emotion, "I want you." She looked up at me, her eyes filled with the same intensity that burned inside me. "I want you too, Nathan." We lost ourselves in each other that night, the world outside fading away as we gave in to the passion that had been building between us for so long. Every touch, every kiss was filled with a need that bordered on desperation, as if we were trying to make up for all the time we had spent denying our feelings. As we lay together afterward, our bodies still entwined, a quiet sense of peace settled over us. The weight of what we had done was still there, but it was overshadowed by the warmth of her touch, the softness of her breath against my skin. For a long time we said nothing, both of us content to simply be in each other's presence, to let the silence speak for us. But eventually, reality began to creep back in, and with it, the questions we had been avoiding. "What happens now?" Evelyn asked softly, her voice trembling slightly. I didn't have an answer. I didn't know what came next, didn't know how to navigate the complicated feelings we had for each other, but I knew one thing for sure: I didn't want to lose her. "We take it one day at a time," I said, echoing the words I had spoken weeks before. "We figure it out together." She nodded, her eyes filled with both hope and uncertainty. "I don't want to lose you, Nathan. But it's going to be hard." "I know," I said, squeezing her hand. "But I'm not going anywhere. We'll face whatever comes next, together." And so we lay there in the quiet of her living room, holding each other as the weight of what we had done settled over us. There were no easy answers, no clear path forward. But in that moment, none of that mattered. All that mattered was the connection we had found, the undeniable bond that had formed between us. As I drifted off to sleep, wrapped in her arms, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. It wouldn't be easy, and there would be moments of doubt and fear. But we had found something real, something worth fighting for. And in the end, that was all that mattered.